I think before we can answer why MISRA-C was needed, we probably need to wind back to what was actually happening from my experience in Ford Motor Company at the time. And we were about to develop from scratch a full drive authority diesel engine controller. Historically, we'd used assembler, and this was our first project that we were going to use C for. So we had questions, was C the right language? What do we need to make C safe? So Dave Newman and myself set about trying to understand what some of those options were. We talked to a couple of companies. We sort of misunderstood actually in some ways the answer we got, because one of the companies was I think Praxis or whoever they were back then, and Sparkada, and the concept of a highly constrained language with an extra type. Must have been after 92, so about 92 to 93, 94 when we kicked this off. So the alternative was people selling static analysis coding standards on C, and I can't recall exactly the chronology of it, but the excellent book that was the volume that we all at some point in that process all got, and so C was of course Les Hatton's Safer C book. So basically we knew that we needed inside Ford Motor Company a coding standard to develop a software system that was going to have more authority than we'd seen before. We'd seen a message that said C was not, in its untainted form, was a language with questions. I think we were already seeing drafts of 65A, which subsequently became IEC 61508, where tables were saying don't use C, but use a subset of C. And so we really asked the question and procured a vendor, which was Programming Research, which was please write Ford Motor Company a coding standard.
I was at Programming Research. I was a founder of Programming Research. We founded the company in 1989, thereabouts. Between 1990 and 1992, I was involved with developing static analyzers for various languages, one of which was C. In that period, as part of this, because I'm a scientist by training, I spent a great deal of time doing experiments because we were given a lot of code. And I used the code that we were given to develop the statistics necessary to see where certain features of the language, which we considered to be weak, which were widely considered to be weak, were appearing, and how often in various genres of programming. What I found was that they appeared more or less uniformly in all industries. Nobody was better than anybody else. And eventually I wrote all that up and published a book in 1994 called Safer C. Concurrently with that, and I think this would have been about 1993, we had been in contact with Gavin and people at Ford giving early experiences of all these experiments, showing what we'd found. We always revealed our data. To argue the case, which I still believe today, that any programming language can be made safe safer if you can understand its deficiencies. If you can't understand them, then you've got no idea what you're doing. It's back to Lord Kelvin's original statement that without measurement things are very impoverished indeed. In fact, they're not even impoverished; they're non-existent. A lesson which the industry could do with learning again and again. So the period 93 to 94, I think it was in late 93, Olwen might correct me on this because Olwen was very closely involved, as was a young man called Andrew Ritchie, who was a proofreader, extraordinaire, I have to say. In that period, we must have produced 20 or 30 programming standards. We didn't just do the same one. We we guided them, we developed them based on what we had found in the code that was given to us, and there were some differences, which are probably cultural, but I don't really know. The bottom line was that by the end of, certainly by probably the middle of 1994, we had this standard in place. I think it was rather earlier than that, and I think I still have a copy at home somewhere. And we were in full flow producing these standards, and we would, in order to make the standards have some bite, because programmers are not very good at maintaining standards, we would configure the tools of the time to each standard individually, so that the tool would give a warning if the standard was breached. So we felt that this would be easier to sell to programmers, and I'd written some technical papers in journals of the time because we could demonstrate the existence of problems which they acknowledged, and then therefore were happy not to have made those mistakes in their code. And that'll do as a start, and I'll pass this over to Olwyn if I may.
Well, I joined programming research in 1995 after a project of 3 years duration at BT. And while I was at BT, I'd written a rather large coding standard for C, essentially aimed at helping them make C more portable. But of course, making a language portable, you were trying to avoid the silly areas of the language, so it has much wider application than that. I was involved in adapting Les's coding standard template, and I've looked at various individual coding standards based on that template for various for clients of programming research. And then I think it was in summer 1997, or late spring 1997, Austin Rover sent us a coding standard for review. It had rather a large number of rules in it. I had, I think, 3 days to do the review. I looked at the rules and decided that they shouldn't stand. And so what I did over those 3 days was suggest replacements for those rules, rather than just say, oh no, have this smaller set of rules, but which is simpler to police. I said, okay, look, if you want a rule of that flavour, this is what it should be. And I went through their entire list doing that, sent them the recommendations, and thought no more of it. We were paid for doing the consultancy. And the next thing we saw was, I think, in August 1997, where a document was sent to programming research, and it had largely the rules that I'd suggested, which also incorporated some of Les's. But instead of having Austin Rover on the front, it said I think MISRA-C version 0.1. And that was in effect, it was a source document for which started the MISRA-C coding standard development. And I think it's true to say that the originally published C coding standard was very close to the rules that I'd suggested. I think some of them have been weakened in places, and of course you'd written different editorial tutorial material around it, but that's the story as I recall it.
So just to fill in the bit that there was the gap there, I mean, we had our coding standard. Dave Newman was Ford Motor Company's representative, the MISRA steering committee. At that time, I guess it was in its post period of having done its original guidelines and then just sort of talking about related subjects. I didn't go to the actual steering committee meetings until a number of years later, after Dave Newman retired, and the minutes are on a very close nature. I accidentally shared them once and was rebuked for doing so. So I really don't know what was going on at the steering committee. The only sort of feedback I got really was, Rover are also doing a coding standard. In fact, Rover have an overlap that they're have spoken to the same company that we had spoken to. And is there more leverage in us combining the coding standard actually over us doing an individual coding standard? Now I do know, and it was a meeting that did take place. In fact, the MISRA team even thought, it would be such a good idea to have the coding standard to actually invite a tool vendor of course we had one in mind that we visited, to collaborate with us and make the coding standard and the tool enforcement of that coding standard available. Probably with hindsight, making it open probably has made it a bigger standard. But I think that was the first time we met was actually in the offices in Surrey.
Yeah, I'd met one of your colleagues in another part of Ford. I've been trying desperately to remember his name. It may come back to me. And we talked about the same things then. So it was over that period, certainly, we've been kicking this backwards and forwards, and it eventually crystallised. Although, as I recall, the first programming standard we wrote using this methodology was for Philips Medical Systems in Holland for the MRI scanners. And that was in 1994, November 1994, I believe.
Yes, the decision, I think that, the opportunity which we explored, and really probably four of us met actually on the University of Coventry site, because Austin Rover had a site there at the time, was Dave Newman, myself and Ford, Paul Edwards, who did an awful lot of the editorial work, and Roger Rivette, and between sort of two-day meetings, we basically went through the rules. Now, one thing we were actually very keen to achieve was actually not simply publishing the coding standard that Programming Research had given us under contract. So we did actually attempt to find independent reference for all of the rules that we actually made public. And where there were rules that we actually completely failed to find any existing public reference, we actually deleted those rules. So really the actual construction of that document, we've basically had a couple of face-to-face all-day meetings in the University of Coventry with the four that I've just mentioned. When it got time to sort of publish it, then a few more members of the MISRA steering team turned up for more of an editorial meeting on the sort of broader language of the document rather than the nitty-gritty of what does the C language itself mean. And then I think that that gave us the draft that I can't remember, probably after a public review became the release document.
I think my recollection is that that draft that you came out with was about twice the size of the original standard that we'd done, where you'd done all this research and added things, and it settled in at 127 rules and guidelines, and that was MISRA-C.
And I think at the time, because we tried, when we saw that standard, to see how many rules that QAC could enforce, if I recall correctly, it was 85% of the statically enforceable rules could at that time be enforced by QAC. That was before it put MISRA-C specific error messages in.
They were quite close. I wouldn't quite say that it was released cheering into the world. I will have an entirely different view of this than Gavin, of course. Gavin had to make use of this in cutting-edge systems. We were rather more theoretical, working with code, analysing code, and with Allwyn as experience as well. And my original feelings, talking to a number of different companies, were in those companies it was received well. Wider, it seemed to make almost no difference for quite a long time. Maybe it still does, but certainly with the companies with whom we worked closely, we had a very good rapport with the engineers because they bought into it. They knew why we were doing what we were doing. They could see in the MISRA-C standard that it was reflected in reality, the reality of measuring systems. This is really important, I think, but that's generally my view. Wider perspective, maybe not, because so much of the code in the world then was written in the USA. And we had little impact there at the time.
Okay, so as we just said, the MISRA-C document was published. In some ways, that sort of gave, from my perspective, the project that I was working on in the UK, we were using the standard that had already been written by rote programming research anyway. What it actually gave us was a bigger stick, actually to help bring on the whole of Ford Motor Company actually. So we launched the original document, and what we immediately found was, we within the project in Ford Motor Company used that very well. And in fact, the project had almost an uncanny lack of hard-to-find defects, considering the amount of new code we were making. What we were also getting is feedback from people that were using it, and recognizing ourselves that there were questions. And really Paul Edwards actually left Rover at that stage, and we sort of morphed into a team to produce, to sort of continue discussing the MISRA-C. And we originally produced a technical corrigenda to correct issues in that first document, and then subsequently went on, I think, recognizing that there was more work that we could do to produce a MISRA 2. In fact, just the meetings to walk through the document and address all the rules would take 2 days, and we saw a need for more. At least in the companies that were using it, we were making good progress. And I think the thing that helped was the fact that at that point it went basically from being Ford and Rover to actually having, I think, the excellent support of some of the tool vendors, although you mustn't have too many tool vendors dominating. And we also got actually people from other industries who were very keen on making C, or a subset of C, fit for purpose for wider use. So the title, really we reflected the fact that we knew at that stage it was being used across many industries, and there is nothing special about putting software in a car. Software is software. It doesn't care what the final product is, and I think it's anybody that's writing C, I'd like to be sure that they're using the best C that they can. I mean, progressively, that's also, we had C89, C90, which really were the same C. We had, I've now gone blank as to which was the next C.
C99.
C99, thank you. So, that introduced new features as well that we could see. And in fact, MISRA-3 goes on to address some of those further language features. And, as the language grows, or matures,
Evolves.
Develops, in whatever, I think there is a continuing need that we match those new features. I think one of the comments almost is that as they add new language features, we create rules that stop anybody using them.
There's a tradition in the MISRA documents that Rule 1 is always the base standard of the time, and as Gavin says, MISRA 1 was based on, actually C90 was the first ISO standard. The next ISO standard was ISO C99, which was significantly bigger than the previous standard, so there's an obvious need for these guys to move the MISRA-C standard along to reflect the change in the root language, and this has happened again with C11, which was the latest incarnation of ISO-C.
Yeah, the other thing we actually did do between C1 and C2 was actually try to develop a conformance suite, as we called it, compliance suite. We've spent a lot of time arguing about what compliance or conformance precisely meant. And in fact, it was in that period that actually there was a whole number even of people that were starting up software tools just to check MISRA-C.